as the designee of the Majority Leader.
Thank you, Mr. Speaker. I appreciate the privilege of addressing you here on the floor of the United States House of Representatives and to have an opportunity to inject some dialogue into the ears and minds of this body and across the country as people observe the deliberations here in the House. I came to the floor, Mr. Speaker, to address the issue of immigration again. And as we're watching the acceleration of an immigration proposal that's coming through, moving in this direction at a minimum from the United States Senate, it's important for us, Mr. Speaker, to recognize that there are a series and set of beliefs over there that don't necessarily conform with the majority here in the House of Representatives. And if you look at the names and the reputations and the faces of the people that are advocating for, quote, comprehensive immigration reform, close quote, and you recognize the history of some of them, you know, regretfully, Senator Teddy Kennedy is not here to advocate, but he's one of the original proponents of, I call it comprehensive amnesty. He was one of the voices in 2086. He's, in fact, one of the voices back in the 60s on immigration, quote, comprehensive immigration reform, close quote. Ronald Reagan signed the Amnesty Act of 1986. We do have some people around here of significant credibility that were part of that process back then, Mr. Speaker. And one of those is Attorney General Ed Meese. Attorney General Meese was there as a counselor and advisor to the President. He read the 86 Amnesty Act, of course, and he had full access to President Reagan. And they all, his cabinet members, a good number of them weighed in with President Reagan. And I remember where I was. I was running my construction company back in '86 during the middle of the farm crisis. I remember being in my office when I'd been watching the debate and reading the news and seeing what was moving through the United States Congress, and all the while believing that if you waive the application of the law to people who have willfully broken the laws, it is a reward for those lawbreakers to waive it. And if you reward them with the objective of their crime, as the 1986 Amnesty Act did, then the result of that is not what was promised. What was promised was we will now enforce immigration law forever, and there will never be another Amnesty Act. That was the promise. And the enforcement was that we had to file I-9 forms for every job applicant, which would put the pertinent data of the job applicant down on the I-9 form, and we dotted all the I's and we crossed all the T's on the I-9 form, and we looked at the identification documents of the applicants that were applying to come to work for my construction company and thousands of companies across America. The full expectation, we had, Mr. Speaker, the full expectation that the Immigration Naturalization Services, then INS, and now ICE, would be coming and knocking on our door and going through our records to make sure that we did everything exactly right, because the force of enforcement was what was going to justify the amnesty that was granted in the '86 Amnesty Act. And now, we were going to control the border, we were going to enforce and control our border and our ports of entry, and enforce the law against those who were unlawfully working in the United States. And in exchange for that, there was going to be the legalization of some first 700,000 to 800,000 people in the United States that were here illegally. Got advertised up to be, or I'll say adjusted up to be, 1 million people that turned out to be 3 million people. Lowest number turned out to be on the '86 Amnesty Act 2.7 to 2.8 million. The highest number is someplace around 3.5 or 6 million. But in that neighborhood of 3 million people took advantage of the 1986 Amnesty Act. That's triple, by anybody's number, the original estimate. And the trade-off again was, in order to get an agreement with the Senator Teddy Kennedy types that were in the United States Senate and House at the time, there had to be a concession made. Now, from where I come from, Mr. Speaker, it's really pretty easy. The rule of law is the rule of law. The Constitution is the supreme law of the land. Legislating is the exclusive province of Article 1 within this Constitution, the legislative branch of government, the United States Congress, the House and the Senate on opposite sides of the rotunda, coming to a conclusion, and we concur, pass a conference report. That goes to the President. When the President signs that, it becomes law. And that's the law that we abide by. It's not complicated to understand. That's what they teach in 8th grade civics class, but the expectation that the law would be enforced and the real effort on the part of President Reagan to do so was eroded by people that undermined that effort. Many of them never intended to follow through on the law enforcement side of the bargain, not only the border security, but also the workplace jobs enforcement side. The legislation that some was formed then, some came along in 1996, that required that the immigration enforcement officers, when they encountered someone that was unlawfully in the United States, that they are required by law to place them into removal proceedings. That's the law. Ronald Reagan was an honorable man. I had great faith in the principles that he so clearly articulated to the entire nation and the world with utter confidence. And when I saw that amnesty legislation pass out of the House and the Senate back in 1986, I had so much confidence in the clarity of the vision and understanding of Ronald Reagan that I was confident that he would veto the misguided Amnesty Act of 1986, because you can't trade off amnesty for a promise that there would be law enforcement or border security. First thing you do is you enforce the law. You establish that the law is enforced. And what if there had been 700,000 or 800,000 people in the United States then who were living in the shadows? And what if we would have enforced the border at the time, if we'd enforced immigration law at the time, and if we'd enforced and shut off the jobs magnet at the time? Then that number that was viewed to be an intolerably high number in '86, that 700,000 to 800,000, would have become instead a number that would have been less than that, not more than that. If you enforced the law in '86, there would have been fewer people unlawfully in the United States, not more. But instead, as time went on, and by the way, neither Ronald Reagan nor his successor, George H.W. Bush, saw a particular political bump for signing the Amnesty Act or for supporting it. I think, regardless, as time went on, there was less and less respect for the law because there was less and less enforcement of the law. As much as Ronald Reagan would have liked to enforce the law, he didn't have everybody bought in on that, Mr. Speaker. And so as the undermining of the enforcement and the turning of the blind eye took place, there was less and less respect for the rule of law. Employers themselves began to understand INS is not going to be in your workplace. They're not going to go through your HR records. They're not going to apply sanctions against employers for hiring people that are unlawfully present in the United States and can't legally work in the United States. No, Mr. Speaker, the respect for the law was diminished because there was less enforcement of the law in the workplace, on the border, and then we began to see the advocates for open borders start to emerge. Well, I want to compliment former chairman of the Judiciary Committee, Lamar Smith, for the stellar work that he has done in the immigration reform legislation that he was a central figure of when he was ranking member of the Immigration Subcommittee back in 1996. Continually, I look back at the language that was put in place then, and I'm continually thankful because this nation has been rewarded by the vision of now Congressman Lamar Smith, and it has made our jobs easier here. But also, 1996 immigration reform, which was enforcement reform, was triggered off of, to some degree, Barbara Jordan's study that took place in around 1991, if I remember correctly, that if you grant amnesty, you'll get more people coming in here illegally. And the principles are this: you reinforce the law, you have to place people in removal proceedings if they violate the law. It is not a draconian thing to do. If you put someone back in the condition they were in before they broke the law, that's not a particularly draconian punishment. And if that's hard to understand, Mr. Speaker, and I know you understand all things, but think of it this way. If someone goes in and robs a bank, and they step out on the steps of the bank with the sack of the loot, and law enforcement appears and says, sorry, you can't keep the loot, and we're going to put that back in the bank, but you can go. That's the equivalent of removal. You don't get to keep the objective of the crime. We put you back in the condition that you were in before you committed the crime. That's not draconian. That's the minimum you can do and still have a rule of law apply. And you can't be a nation if you don't have borders. And if you don't determine as a nation what crosses those borders, people or goods, contraband or not, if you don't make those decisions as a government, as a people, then it's out of control. Then you're really not a nation. Then immigration policy is set by the people that decide they're going to break your laws and come across that border. And if we decide we're not going to enforce those laws, we have, as is often advertised by people in both bodies this year, not so much last year, this year, as de facto amnesty. De facto amnesty. That means, well, the equivalent of amnesty in Latin. But they also argue we have to do something to resolve the circumstances of ending this de facto amnesty because it's an unjust condition to have people in. Now, I don't feel that same injustice, Mr. Speaker, because, first of all, the people that are here living under the described de facto amnesty made the decision to come here and live in the shadows. And some will say, well, they didn't if they were a child when they were brought by their parents. And that's true to a degree. And the group of people that we are the most sympathetic to are those dreamers, those kids that were brought here when they were young, that have gone through our educational system, paid for by U.S. taxpayers, by the way, that may have a significant opportunity in this country, but are subject to removal just like their parents who clearly knew they were breaking the law. Some of those people have been boldly lobbying across these Capitol grounds, and there's a circumstance not that long ago where the president of the ICE union, Chris Crane, who is the lead plaintiff in the lawsuit of Crane versus Napolitano, that seeks to correct the unconstitutional actions of the executive branch, including the president. But Chris Crane was testifying before a Senate Judiciary Committee on immigration, and while that was going on, they had people that were illegal aliens in the United States, unlawfully present in the United States. By the way, that's a legal term, illegal alien. But they were in the room in the Senate Judiciary Committee while the president of the ICE union is testifying. And they were also in the hallway outside the Judiciary Committee as recently as yesterday, and they had been invited into the Judiciary Committee, or at least recognized and introduced inside the House Judiciary Committee by former Chairman, now Ranking Member John Conyers of Michigan. How far have we come, Mr. Speaker, when we have people who are subject at the specific directive of the law that when encountered by the law enforcement officers, they are required by law to place them in removal proceedings, and now they come into the United States Capitol and insist that we change the law to accommodate lawbreakers. If we do that, whatever our hearts say about the dreamers, whatever the short-term piece is about that small segment of the larger group of people that's defined as 11 million and probably is 2 or more times greater than that, whatever our heart says about that, we're eroding the rule of law if we grant a component of amnesty. Our rule of law is more sacred to us than the sympathy that we turn towards people that maybe didn't make this decision themselves. But I can tell you, Mr. Speaker, that the President has directed, and it is in the letter of the executive memos that have been produced by John Morton, the head of ICE, and supported by Janet Napolitano, who is the Secretary of Homeland Security, who is the subject of the lawsuit, led by Chris Crane, the president of ICE, naming Janet Napolitano, and has been before the court in the Northern District of Texas and received roughly a 90% decision at this point from Judge Reed O'Connor, that when Congress says shall, it doesn't mean may. In other words, if you're for open borders, Mr. President, but the law says thou shalt not read the law to mean you may enforce the law. It says you shall enforce the law. The President of the United States takes an oath of office, and it's prescribed in the Constitution. And part of the language that he adheres to is to take care that the laws be faithfully executed. That means enforced. Doesn't mean kill the law, Mr. Speaker. It doesn't mean tear the Constitution up and throw it out the window. It means take care the laws be faithfully executed. In other words, enforce the law. The President has defied his own oath of office, and he has prohibited the ICE and other law enforcement officers from enforcing the clear letter of the law. And some of that was law that was put in place in 1986 under the pen of Lamar Smith, who was the lead sponsor on the immigration reform legislation of that time. The President gave a speech to a high school just out here in Washington, D.C. on March 28th. I believe the date was March 28, 2011, but I know the actual date of the month, not necessarily the year. And when he said to them, "I know you want me to establish the DREAM Act by executive order." In other words, legalize people who were brought here by their parents under the age of 16 and essentially give them a work permit and perhaps a path to citizenship. But he said, "I can't do that. It's not my constitutional authority to waive the law and grant, I'll say, executive amnesty to the Dreamers. Instead," he said, "you understand," he said to the students, "you understand the Constitution, you've been taught and you learn this, that there are three branches of government. And the legislature has to pass the laws, that's Congress, and the President's job is to enforce the laws, that's the President who was speaking before that group on March 28th, and the judicial branch is to interpret the laws." Well, that's a pretty nice, tight, composite summary of the structure of our Constitution and our federal government. And it is worthy of a former adjunct law professor who taught constitutional law at the University of Chicago, President Barack Obama. He understood it clearly. He articulated it clearly to the young people there at the high school just outside here in D.C. And March 28th, a little over a year later, the President decided that he wasn't no longer going to respect his own word, his own oath of office, or his own interpretation of the Constitution. And just, I'll say, it wasn't necessarily an executive whim. I suspect it was more like a political calculation. But when he did a press conference 2 hours after Janet Napolitano released the memo that created 4 classes of people who were exempted from the law and gave them a work permit. And it said that, and by the way, all lawful presence here in the United States either comes from birth, natural-born citizen, or the naturalization process that's set up by Congress, or the visas, visitors' visas, student visas, H-1Bs, H-2Bs, ag workers, all of the lawful presence in the United States, aside from natural-born citizens, is a product of the United States Congress. Many believe, and I almost entirely agree, that the Constitution defines immigration as the exclusive province of Congress. It clearly defines the legislative activity as the exclusive province of the United States Congress, Article 1 in the Constitution. And so when the President decides he's going to create immigration law, waive the application of the law, and create new law out of thin air, and when Janet Napolitano releases the Morton memo and announces that here are these 4 classes of people now exempt from the law and manufactures a work permit out of thin air, that happened, and 2 hours later the President was doing a press conference repeating the same thing at the White House. So it's not that the President happened to say those things in a press conference. It's not that Janet Napolitano happened to pick the timing of 2 hours before the President's press conference. Of course this was coordinated, and I asked her that under oath before the committee if it was coordinated. The essential answer after the typical long rambling that you get from those kind of witnesses was yes. And so one can only conclude that either it was by the order of the President or the consent of the President that the Constitution itself, I believe, was violated. I believe that the separation of powers was violated, and it appears to me from reading Judge Reed O'Connor's decision in the case of Crane versus Napolitano, he agrees also, and wrote repeatedly, shall mean shall, it doesn't mean may. When the law says shall be enforced, shall be placed into removal proceedings, it means exactly that. And so I expect that we will see a final decision out of the Northern District of Texas. Roughly 90% of the arguments that we made before the court were agreed to by Judge Reed O'Connor, and the other one was one that the executive branch's argument was, let's see, less intelligible than it needed to be before a definitive decision could be rendered by a prudent judge, Reed O'Connor. And we'll see that decision perhaps come down very soon, and I expect that this administration will litigate this all the way to the Supreme Court and insist that the President can legislate by executive order or executive edict, that they can provide executive amnesty. If the President can suspend any law, if he has the authority to suspend any law, and he has the authority to manufacture any law out of thin air, and the out of thin air was the work permit, just as a reminder, made up a work permit so that the dreamers that he had exempted from the law could legally, and just really questionable about the legally part, could work in the United States. If the President can manufacture law out of thin air, and if the President can order that the law be suspended, and if the President of ICE can be sitting in a room with people that are unlawfully present in the United States and compelled by law to place them in removal proceedings, but prohibited by order of the President or his executive minions, we have come to a very bad place in America, Mr. Speaker. Our Constitution itself is threatened. The function of the three branches of government has been so blurred by an executive that has contempt for his own oath and contempt for the Constitution itself and the separation of powers. And each time that we go to the court to get an answer, we're asking the third branch of government to be the referee between the two competing branches, the executive and the legislative branch. And the Founding Fathers, as they set up this magnificent and brilliant and balanced Constitution between the three branches of government, they envisioned this. Each branch of government would have its own constitutional power. And that power was something that wasn't precisely defined between the three branches of government. They expected the judicial branch would be the weakest of the three branches of government. Some years it is, some years it's not. But they also expected that the executive branch, the President, and the legislative branch, Congress, would reach a level of tension between the two where each branch would jealously guard the constitutional authority that's vested within it in the supreme law of the land, the Constitution. And instead, it seems as though these members of Congress, 435 here and 100 senators over on the other side, even though we all take an oath to uphold the Constitution of the United States, seem to have a different understanding of what this Constitution really is. And they seem to have a blurred and weak understanding of the legislative authority that we have here. Our Founding Fathers envisioned that they put all of the power of the purse right here in the House of Representatives. Spending bills start here. There can't be a dollar spent by this government unless the House of Representatives approves it, whether we start it here and the Senate amends it and it comes back, or whether we start it here and the Senate approves it and it goes to the President's desk. There can't be money spent unless this House approves it. And so we have the power of the purse. And they expected we would use the power of the purse in order to restrain an out-of-control executive. They set some other structure in place, too, that none of us want to contemplate having to use the more draconian approach to this. But the President of the United States has defied the authority here of Congress in his own oath of office, and this Congress has not gotten its back up nearly enough to defend the constitutional authority that we have or the affront to it. And so, in an appropriations bill last week, I offered an amendment that would prohibit any of the funds from being used to carry out the orders that came from John Morton and Janet Napolitano and approved by President Obama that grant this executive amnesty to the four classes of people. This is a whole series of 6 memos known as the Morton Memos. And no money can be used to enforce or implement or execute the special work permit created either by those memos. And that amendment was debated here on the floor, vigorously, I might add, very late at night. And I made a strong constitutional argument, I believe. Members of Congress came down here to the floor of the House and they voted by a vote of 224 to 201 to support my amendment. This Congress has spoken. We may disagree on what we do with people that are unlawfully here, but the majority of the House of Representatives, that 224 vote, clearly said we're going to defend our constitutional authority to legislate. We're not going to allow the President to make it up as he goes along, and we're going to constrain the purse strings of a President that would legislate by executive edict, which in this case is executive amnesty. So that's a move in the right direction, Mr. Speaker. But as I see the things unfolding in the United States Senate and the language that comes out of there and the argument that has been repeatedly made here on the floor of the House and to some extent in the Senate. We have de facto amnesty. De facto amnesty is a reality because the President, as I said, broke his own oath of office. We've gone to court to do all we can do there, and that's moving through the system. But there's another way that's this thing that's happening, and that is this. In the minds of too many members of Congress, they believe that we have to conform our legislation to the President's will. Because the President has refused to enforce the law, they argue that we should conform the law to something the President will enforce. That's way outside my ability to reason within the confines of the Constitution, Mr. Speaker. I can think of a time or two, and there have been more, I'm sure, that the Supreme Court ruled. And they came down with a ruling that this Congress agreed was a constitutional interpretation. The partial birth abortion legislation was one of those. Congress passed a ban on partial birth abortion. The ruling that came out of the Supreme Court was that the language that banned partial birth abortion was too vague, and there wasn't a provision in it that made an exception for the life or health of the mother. So Congress went back to work. We rolled up our sleeves. I was there in those discussions and in the debate and helped move it forward. Steve Chabot of Ohio was the principal sponsor of that legislation. It defined the act precisely from a medical perspective of partial birth abortion. We brought in experts that testified over and over again, and we brightened the definition and a brighter line on what that was. And the congressional findings after much medical deliberation was that a partial birth abortion is never necessary to save the life of the mother. That it just doesn't occur from a medical perspective. Yes, there are those dissenters out there, Mr. Speaker. I don't bring this up for that reason. Congress read the Supreme Court decision and conformed our legislation to the decision that was a precedent decision of the United States Supreme Court. That shows a decent respect for the jurisprudence of the judicial branch of government. And it's appropriate for this Congress to respect the judgment of the other branches of government. But we all take an oath to uphold the Constitution. We're not bound by someone else's judgment of what that oath means or what the Constitution means. We're bound by a clear understanding of the Constitution itself, the text of the Constitution, the original text plus the amendments. The Constitution has to mean what it says. It has to mean what it says on its face. That's what words are there for. It has to also mean what it was understood to mean at the time of ratification, or there's no guarantee. This Constitution, Mr. Speaker, is a contractual guarantee that we received starting in 1789, amended 27 times since then. Every single amendment in there, all the language in there has to mean what it was understood to mean at the moment of ratification. It can't be changed in its definition because it's inconvenient for today, or our Founding Fathers would have not given us a means to amend this Constitution. It has to mean what it's was understood to mean, and you can't change its definition because if you do so, you're breaking an intergenerational contract that was handed to us in 1789 to be preserved, protected, and defended, this Constitution. And so each member of Congress needs to understand that, take an oath to uphold this Constitution. We do that, defend it, but when the reasonable jurisprudence of a constitutional analysis comes from the Supreme Court, we conform to that. In the case of partial birth abortion, we've conformed in a number of other times, and that's a respectful thing to do from one branch of government to the other. But when the President of the United States defies the literal language in the law and orders that there be no application of the law because he disagrees with the law and manufactures a work permit out of thin air, and when a Congress accepts the President's idea on that and decides that we are going to pass legislation as has been offered by the Gang of 8 in the Senate and the Gang of 8 minus 1, now 7 in the House, that we're going to conform this Congress to the whim of the President. Not that we agree with his policy, but they say, well, you'll never get enforcement of the law unless you conform the law to what the President's willing to do. My gosh. what would the Founding Fathers say if the Chief Executive Officer of the United States and our Commander-in-Chief defies his own oath of office by his own definition at the school March 28th, as I said, refuses to enforce the law, pledges to punish even the President of the Immigration Customs Enforcement Union for doing what he's commanded by law to do? The President does that, and there's any kind of mindset here in Congress that we should conform the law to the President's whim. No, Mr. Speaker, the President has this alternative. If he disagrees with the law of the land and he wants to see it changed, then he can ask people in this Congress, the House and the Senate, House or the Senate for that matter, would you kindly draft some legislation that would please me, and I'll be supportive of it as you try to work it through the legislative process, through regular order, as our Speaker often says. That's the President's alternative. He doesn't write law. He does have the opportunity to veto laws that he disagrees with that reach his desk. But technically, the President can't even introduce a piece of legislation here in the House or the Senate. But we know that there are friends of the President that are willing to do that, and it should be so that the President can advocate for legislation and ask people to move it through the system. But instead, as I said, he's defied his oath. He has challenged this Congress, and some Republicans and most Democrats appear to have had this spell cast upon them that suspends their otherwise good judgment, and they're working down the path of a comprehensive amnesty plan in the Senate, and the stage is set here in the House where I can surely see something similar emerging here. We need to stand up and argue there's a future for this country. There's a destiny for this country. It is a precious thing that we hold in our hands here. The destiny of the United States of America. The pillars of American exceptionalism built this. And you can open this Constitution up and go to the Article 1, 2, and 3, the legislative, the executive, and the judicial branches of government, in priority order, I would say, because Article 1 reflects more directly the voice of the people, the legislature, the Congress. And if there's a conflict between the three branches of government, how is it resolved, Mr. Speaker? If you dig deeply into this and you look at our history and you watch how things have reacted, sometimes the judicial branch comes out on top. Sometimes the executive branch comes out on top. Sometimes the legislative branch comes out on top. But if push comes to shove, it's the people, we the people, that come out on top. And that's why the House of Representatives has elections every 2 years, so we can be the quick reaction force when people get their back up and they don't like the direction their government is going. They recruit people, they step up, they run for office, and 2 years later, 2 years or less later, there's an election, and often new people come into the House of Representatives that more acutely affect the values and the wishes of those who elected them. We saw that happen in 2010. The year 2009/2010 brought us Obamacare. We saw tens of thousands of people all around this Capitol. We saw not just a human chain, not just a human ring, but a human donut formed around the United States Capitol. People 6 and 8 deep, human contact all the way around the United States Capitol. And I went up to look at it, and I walked around to look at it. If we could have, of course, for airspace, helicopters can't go up and take pictures. There's no way to get that shot. And I wish I had gone up with a camera up on top and done a panoramic, interconnectable picture so that people could see the magnificent unity of the American people, hand to hand, 6 to 8 deep, that thick, a human donut all the way around the Capitol saying, keep your hands off of our health care. Keep your hands off of our health insurance. That protest was defied when the then Speaker, Nancy Pelosi, walked through the throng with her huge magnum gavel. You'll remember that, Mr. Speaker, about that long, in a show of and a display of, what should I call it, regality. The regal speaker was coming through with her big gavel to rule over the American people who said, keep your hands off of our health care. To this day, I don't know of a single legitimate poll that says that they want Obamacare over the repeal of Obamacare. The last number I saw was 56% of the American people want to see Obamacare repealed. They came here to this city and they said, keep your hands off our health care. Tens of thousands. They came on 3 different occasions that I recall, on November 5th, and then later on in March, about March 22nd or so, a Thursday, and then again on a Saturday. Some of them flew up here to be here on a Thursday, flew back home and got the call to come back again. They didn't leave the airport. They just went to the ticket counter and came back. They care that much about our freedom. And still, Obamacare is being imposed upon them. But they went to the polls in the fall of 2010. They elected 87 new freshman Republicans to come serve here in the House of Representatives, and every single one of them ran on the ticket of repealing Obamacare. Every single one. 87 new freshmen. A magnificent turnover. A class that I called God's gift to America. Now, that class of 87 is here, most of them still here, and a new class has been elected. All of the freshmen that came in on my side of the aisle, Mr. Speaker, and all of those that came in 2010, and every Republican in the House of Representatives has voted to repeal Obamacare. I believe up until, I'll say last fall's election, I'm not certain what's happened in the Senate, but up till that time, every Republican senator has voted to repeal Obamacare. They all took that pledge. That's an example of the quick reaction force of the people. Now, it didn't work out so well with the presidential election, but I can tell you that if that election result had been different for the presidency, the Obamacare repeal bill and getting past, I'll say, a new majority in the United States Senate would have gone to a new president's desk. But it's passed out of this House of Representatives. I drafted the 40-word repeal language in the middle of the night after the Obamacare legislation was passed. I wasn't alone doing that. I had company doing that. But the response of the American people overcomes the bright lines here, or I'll say overcomes the division between the lines of the 3 branches of government. It's the people who will speak. And when people rise up, when they elect new people to the United States Congress, when their voice is heard in the ballot box electing a president, then even a Supreme Court decision can be reversed by the voice of the people. It may take a constitutional amendment, but in the end, power is something that you can assume. Anyone can assume power. We do that in our own families when we direct our children to stay out of the cookie jar, for example. And as long as they respect that power, you have that power, Mr. Speaker. But if it's challenged and defied, then the power disappears and it goes to whatever entity can claim that power, whatever entity can successfully assert that power. So we're in this struggle right now. The President's hand is in the Article I legislative cookie jar. He's reached in and said, I'm taking these cookies of immigration because I don't like the law that exists. I refuse to enforce the law, and I'm going to make up a new law while we're at it. And it's almost like having a child with his hand in the cookie jar with that defiant look in his eye thinking, and you can't do anything about it. You can go to the judicial branch and you can litigate. We've done that. The court's one day going to come down with a decision. Will the President honor the decision of the court? If it gets all the way to the Supreme Court, will he honor it or will he defy it? I sat here on this floor, Mr. Speaker, as the President spoke from the rostrum right behind me, lectured the Supreme Court that sat over here and told them that their decision was wrong. That's not a decent respect for the opinions of mankind that are seated in the United States Supreme Court. That blurs the lines between the judicial and the executive branch of government. It also tells me that we have a president who doesn't understand his restraint. But I'm troubled by a Congress that will allow that to happen, will allow that presidential hand into the legislative cookie jar, because we take an oath to uphold the Constitution. It's our obligation to do that. That means we defend the constitutional authority that we've taken an oath to uphold. That's where we sit. Now when we get to the policy side of this from an immigration perspective, Mr. Speaker, if you reward people who break the law, you get more lawbreakers. It's that simple an equation. I knew that in 1986. I knew that as a businessman who was working through the farm crisis years of the 80s to keep my company up and going and try to get it and keep it profitable and raise my young children at the time. But I remember when Ronald Reagan signed the Amnesty Act, that is a big mistake. That was one of only 2 times that the great man whom I have great respect for, Ronald Reagan, let me down. Only twice in 8 years, but it comes back to haunt us yet to this day. Why did I know in 1986, not being a member of Congress, being a guy that had only been in business 9 years at the time, that had 3 young sons that were roughly 10 and under, and a wife at home that was also working, how did I know that that was a mistake? What was it within me? I didn't have the background that matched up with Attorney General Meese, for example, or the President of the United States. I'm outside of little Kyron, Iowa, 300 people at the time. I can't see a neighbor from my porch. But I knew that that was a mistake. I had no idea that this many years later I'd be standing on the floor of the United States Congress making this case. It wasn't a matter of clairvoyance. It was a matter of what was justice. It was a matter of growing up in a law enforcement family and being steeped in reverence for this supreme law of the land, this Constitution, and understanding that if you don't like the law, you abide by it. But there's a means to change it, whether you're the President of the United States or whether you're this young fella that is trying to run a business and raise his family but have respect for the rule of law. And when you cross those lines, and especially when you do so from the office of the White House, the President of the United States, it's the equivalent of taking a jackhammer to one of the beautiful marble pillars of American exceptionalism. Now, to define what those pillars are, they're here in the Bill of Rights. The First Amendment is real easy. Freedom of speech. That's a pillar of exceptionalism. Without it, we can't be the great country we are. Freedom of religion. Same answer. Without it, we can't be the great country that we are. Freedom of speech, religion, the press, assembly, the right to keep and bear arms, the property rights that used to exist in the Fifth Amendment before the Kelo decision that we sought to restore in the Judiciary Committee just a couple of days ago. No double jeopardy, tried by a jury of your peers, a speedy trial, no cruel and unusual punishment. The rights that are not defined in the Constitution devolve to the states respectively or to the people. Those are all pillars of exceptionalism. Free enterprise capitalism is another one. Without free enterprise capitalism, we don't have this vigorous and robust economy that we have. That's on the citizenship test, by the way. What is the economic system of the United States? Free enterprise capitalism. How about the property rights that exist within intellectual property up until we amended some of the patent, trademark, and the patent and trademark laws? That property rights to intellectual property is one of the big reasons why the United States has been so successful. So I put this all together, and I'd add to that, this country was settled by the values of Western civilization, Judeo-Christianity included in a prominent form. All of that arrived here on this continent at the dawn of the Industrial Revolution and in the concept of manifest destiny that settled this country from sea to shining sea. And I can look back and try to reverse engineer America and think, where did we make a turn that I could, even on Monday morning quarterbacking rules, make a recommendation that we should have turned another direction. I can't reverse engineer America and come up with a greater country than we are. Except maybe I'd go back to 1986 and say, Ronald Reagan, if you'd have just vetoed the Amnesty Act in '86, I wouldn't be standing here right now. We wouldn't have a Senate that's seeking to stampede an Amnesty Act across the rotunda over to us. I wouldn't have this spell that seems to be cast over too many Republicans that somehow if we just pass an Amnesty Act, everything's going to be all right in political viability, Republicans will be okay going into the future. This spell that has suspended good judgment and reason, suspended their ability to listen to empirical data and weigh the policy. The immigration issue cuts across all the components of constitutional conservatism. Anything that has to do with family, for example, with the rule of law, with the economy, with national defense and national security. Almost every issue that we deal with in this Congress is touched somehow by immigration. It is not a simple topic. It's not something where you just say, well, I feel sorry for the Dreamers, therefore I'm going to grant amnesty, I'll support amnesty, and I get that off the table, and maybe the next Congress can deal with it. It does not work like that, Mr. Speaker. This is an irrevocable and irreversible advocacy for amnesty. It's something that cannot be undone. Obamacare, as bad as it is, and I've spent more than 3 years of my life fighting Obamacare and working to defeat it before it became law and repeal it after it became law, And that's a matter of clear public record. But, Mr. Speaker, if I have to accept this perpetual and retroactive amnesty that is offered by the Gang of Eight, or what I expect can come from the Gang of 8-1 here in the House, if I have to choose between perpetual and retroactive amnesty and Obamacare, I'm going to accept the Obamacare and defeat the perpetual and retroactive amnesty, because later on we can repeal Obamacare. We can undo it. We can take it apart and we can roll it back, and we can put together a doctor-patient relationship and a really healthy healthcare system in the United States. We know what it looks like. We knew what to do. We couldn't get it done because we didn't have the votes. But you can undo Obamacare, Mr. Speaker, but you cannot undo comprehensive amnesty, because once that genie is out of the bottle, there's no putting the genie back in the bottle. It becomes as amorphous as a puff of smoke, and if they don't have the political will to enforce the law now, why would they have the political will to enforce the law after amnesty would be granted? They argue that they have all these tight provisions put into the bill, that there's border security in the bill, and we'll get tight borders from this point on. No, when you read the legislation, there's no prospect of that. It's almost, I would have to hide my face to say something like that and wink and cross my fingers behind my back with the other hand. They don't mean it. They don't believe it. They write it because it is just a vague, open, comprehensive placebo for those who want border security, to give people something to hide behind. If you say that Janet Napolitano has got this time to come up with a plan to secure the border, it doesn't mean secure the border. It doesn't mean implement the plan. It just says come up with a plan. And if they're not satisfied with that, then they appoint a Border Security Commission, this job to come up with a plan. And if that fails, then they go back to Janet Napolitano again. This isn't that hard, Mr. Speaker. If you're serious about enforcing the border, you can do that. If you would give me Janet Napolitano's job and a president who doesn't tie my hands, I would take the resources that are committed now within the 50 miles of the southern border, the southwest border, and I would get you upwards of the 99th percentile of border security within 3 years. Maybe sooner, but I think it'd take a half a year to get all the administrative thing jump-started. I'm in the construction business. I know how to build a fence, a wall, and a fence. I know what it costs to do that. I'm not proposing we go down. I wouldn't bid such a thing, but I can surely provide some advice. I have designed it already, a fence, a wall, and a fence with access roads going between, so you have a road between the first fence number one, wall as be the second, and fence above that yet. You could patrol both of those areas in between a fence, a wall, and a fence. By doing so, you can secure it. When you have Border Patrol personnel, it's good to have them. Boots on the ground are good. They do a noble job down there under nearly impossible conditions, and I'm a big fan of the Border Patrol, and I'd like to think they know it when I go down there to visit. But when you start expanding boots on the ground because you don't want to put infrastructure in place, it isn't very logical to me. I mean, I live, I say, out in the country in rural Iowa. I live on the corner of gravel roads that go a mile in each of 4 directions where I live. And if Janet Napolitano came to me and said, I want you to secure that mile of road that goes from your house west, and I'm going to pay you $6 million this year to secure that road. And if I thought I might lose the contract next year, maybe I would think, well, I'll hire myself some Border Patrol agents and we'll do our best to catch some of those folks, but we know we're not going to get more than about 25% enforcement. But it's a job, and take it on. But if I had a 10-year contract, it's not any longer $6 million a mile. It's $60 million a mile in a 10-year contract. And if that contract was tied to efficiency, in other words, if they would dock my pay if I didn't enforce the law, if I couldn't secure the border, I can tell you what I would do, Mr. Speaker. I would invest about $2 million a mile to build a fence, a wall, and a fence. Now, $2 million is more than I think it takes. And to put this in perspective for people that might be overhearing our conversation, Mr. Speaker, we can build 4-lane interstate highway across expensive Iowa cornfields for right at $4 million a mile. We buy the land, do the engineering, the archaeological, environmental surveys and study that are there, do the grading, pave it, shoulder it, paint the lines, put the fencing in, seed it, have it done and finished in signs for $4 million a mile. Well, it's easy to see now that if we could do a 4-lane interstate highway for $4 million, we can build a pretty tremendous fence for a couple $1 million, a fence, a wall, and a fence, with just simply patrol roads that allow a person good weather access through that desert part of the country. It isn't hard to figure it out. If you give me $60 million for a mile, I'd put a couple $1 million in a fence, a wall, and a fence. I'd have myself the necessary Border Patrol agents to watch that. I'd put some cameras up to surveil it. I'd put some vibration sensors in. I'd put some kind of technology on there to add to that they don't like me to talk about here on the floor of the House. And we would have ourselves a 99+% secure border. Had we done that back when the Secure Fence Act was passed here in the House, supported by Duncan Hunter from California as the lead author and an excellent leader on this issue, had we done that, we wouldn't be having this discussion today, Mr. Speaker, because the southwest border would have been secure. And then that argument would be taken away. And then when they promise that there will be border security, we would already have it. And if we already had border security, then some of the harder hearts here in Congress could take a look at the 11 million that are here and think, okay, we've demonstrated that we're going to enforce the law from this place forward. Is there an accommodation that we can make? We can't get to that decision because the President refuses to enforce the law. They won't allow that kind of security on the southern border for political reasons, I believe. Our ports of entry are not as tight as they need to be. We don't have an entry-exit system. Piece after piece of this that are necessary for security. And by the way, I have a bill called the New IDEA Act. And what it does is it clarifies that wages and benefits paid to illegals by employers are not tax deductible. And so it subjects that employer to an IRS audit. It gives the employer safe harbor if they use E-Verify, so that an employer could put the employee's numbers into the E-Verify database. If it came back and said it confirms that these folks can work legally in the United States, put them to work without any kind of sanction or punishment for the employer. Safe harbor. But if the IRS comes in during a normal audit, doesn't accelerate the audits, but a normal audit, they would normally then, in the audit under my bill, they would put the Social Security numbers and the identifying information into E-Verify, run those employees through, and if it came back that they could not lawfully work in the United States, they'd give the employer an opportunity and the employee to cure that in case there is misinformation in the data, which gets better every time we use it, and it's very good. Aside from that, the IRS then would rule, sorry, the wages that you knowingly and willfully paid to someone who's unlawfully present in the United States are not a business expense. So wages come out of the Schedule C, they go into the gross receipts column again and show up as net income in the bottom. And the IRS would apply a penalty and an interest against the unpaid taxes plus the taxes to that income, that net income. The effect of this, it would turn your $10 an hour illegal into about a $16 an hour illegal. That makes it a business decision. It means, as an employer, you're going to wonder, what year will I be audited, this year or next year or the year after? Well, it wouldn't be the end of the world if they audit you for a year, but it might be pretty expensive as those years accumulate up to 6 in the statute of limitations. So employers would look at that accumulating statute of limitations of 6 years and decide, I'm going to get to legal. I'm going to work my way through and clean up my workforce. That's a logical business decision. The bill also requires the IRS to work in cooperation with the Social Security Administration and the Department of Homeland Security so that they exchange information for the purposes of enforcing U.S. law. Now, this isn't that hard and it's not complicated. It just takes the will. It takes a decent respect for the opinions of our founding fathers, the opinions of those who have written law before us, and some who serve in this Congress today, a decent respect for the Constitution. Let's reconstruct this respect for the rule of law in this country, Mr. Speaker. Let's reestablish its enforcement. Let's do so while we respect the dignity of every human person and understand that they don't always get the clearest message in the country that they live in. They know they want to leave there, They know they want to come to America. They want to leave for some reasons such as perhaps it's too violent. 58,000 people, some say more, killed in the drug wars in Mexico in the last few years. The rule of law doesn't apply down there the way it does here. People aren't always equal treatment under the law. Sometimes they're shaken down by police officers. That hardly ever happens in this country in a significant way. We have equal protection under the law in America. If you look at the statue of Lady Justice, who is standing there with the scales of justice in her hands, and they are balanced, equal protection, balanced protection under the law. And most times you'll see Lady Justice blindfolded because justice is blind. It needs to treat every human person equally under the law. People come here because they want that kind of protection. It is a component of American exceptionalism, the rule of law. And the Senate is poised to destroy the rule of law, and the House seems to be moving in that direction. I'm very troubled, Mr. Speaker, as I watch one of the essential pillars, the rule of law, of American exceptionalism, be attacked and start to crumble before my very eyes in this country. You know, the job the Founding Fathers had, the vision came from God, that our rights come from God. They all wrote that. They all agreed with that. It's in the Declaration. They put this concept together, inspired, I believe. The concept of a free people, a sovereign people, we the people. They sold that to a large enough percentage of the population in the 13 original colonies that they supported the Declaration. They had to sell it. It wasn't just Thomas Jefferson went into a room, got out the quill, and wrote the Declaration. They were so impressed by the language in it, they decided to embrace it and start a revolution. This was a cultural thing. It was an intellectual thing. It was a faith component. They put that together and they sold it to the people in the 13 original colonies who fought a war to establish this country and then to ratify a constitution. Their job was a lot harder than ours, Mr. Speaker. Our job is to preserve, protect, and defend it. They had to conceive of it, argue for it, sell it to the people, put it down in words and parchment, the Declaration, fight the war, and some give their lives to shape America to the great, great country that we are today. Our job is to preserve and protect and defend this glorious destiny that's out ahead of us. We cannot shrink from it. We cannot trail in the dust our Constitution or the rule of law, no matter what our hearts say about having sympathy for groups of people that may or may not have had to say about whether they came here legally or not. That's what's here to be defended. Next week we're going to be very vigorously defending the rule of law. I'm going to seek to have Lincoln-Douglas-style debates outside of these chambers, outside of the Capitol building on Wednesday, 9 o'clock in the morning. That'll extend, and we'll take a break, a 2-hour break over lunch, and begin again at 2 o'clock in the afternoon, Mr. Speaker. And this is going to be designed so that reasonable people can have an open discussion, just like Stephen Douglas and Abraham Lincoln did. Let's air this out before the public, and let's hear what the public has to say. In fact, if we can work it out, I want to hear from the public as well, Mr. Speaker. It'll be a big week next week, and I'm looking forward to it. We're called to this task. Let's not trail in the dust the golden hopes of humanity. We are the redoubt of Western civilization. If we can't protect the fortress of the rule of law and all of these pillars of American exceptionalism here, we can't look without for Western Europe to save us or Australia to save us. We can look to them as allies. But if our civilization is going to be preserved, it's going to be here in the United States of America. Thank you, Mr. Speaker, and I yield back the balance of my time.
The gentleman yields back.
Mr. Speaker, I move the House to now adjourn. Oh, sorry, I had a...
Under the Speaker's announced policy of January 3rd, 2013, the Chair recognizes the gentleman from Texas, Mr. Gomer, for 30 minutes.
Thank you, Mr. Speaker. We're living in interesting times. It's purported to be a Chinese curse to live in interesting times. But when you see what is confronting this country, what is taking our liberties, what is threatening our way of life, it's clear we're on the front lines of either winning back or losing for all times the greatest freedoms ever given and secured for one group of people. This is an extraordinary country, and it is because, just as our founders pointed out repeatedly, they recognize that our rights are provided by our Creator. But just as any inheritance can be taken by those who are evil, greedy, power-hungry, it must be defended or you lose it. We have people who make no bones about the fact that they want to destroy our way of life, that they think the freedom afforded the American people leads to debauchery, leads to ways of life that are evil and wrong, and therefore they must destroy the freedoms which have provided people the chance to make wrong choices. Our founders would prefer the freedoms, and so would the people here. Unfortunately, there are good people who believe that they are so much smarter and no better than everyone else that, gee, since we're in Congress, we should tell people what they can do, how they can live, how they can make a living, whether they can make a living, or that we may just pay you to do nothing and to never reach your God-given potential. And then, as we heard today, we had an amendment made by our friend on the Democratic side, Mr. Polis, that would have required a new addition to the chaplain corps of every branch of the military. It would be a new addition to the chaplain corps for those who are non-theistic or atheistic, those who believe there's no God. I had no idea that people who do not believe that there is a God needed help and encouragement and support for their unbelief. Astounding. If people truly are atheistic, why would they need help in remaining so? Could it possibly be that the more people look around, the more they see things like Ben Franklin did, 80 years old, and yes, he enjoyed what some people would call pleasures of different types. When he represented us in France, represented us in England, he was a brilliant man, a brilliant man. And the massive painting outside these halls show him sitting front and center at the Constitutional Convention. It was there at that convention when he finally got recognized after they'd been there nearly 5 weeks. And despite so many across the country still miseducating children, unfortunately, by telling them he was a deist, someone who believes there's something, some force, some thing, some deity that created nature, created all of mankind, all of the things in the universe, and if such deity or thing still exists, he, she never interferes with the ways of man. Well, obviously you see Ben Franklin's own words. You know that's not what he believed. When he was 80 years old, 2 years or so away from meeting his maker, he finally got recognized after all the yelling back and forth that was done there at the convention. And someone noted that Washington looked relieved when Mr. Franklin sought attention, or as some at the convention called him Dr. Franklin. And he pointed out during his remarks, and we know exactly what he pointed out, because he wrote it in his own handwriting. People wanted a copy of what he said. Madison made notes, but Franklin wrote it out. Among other things, he said, "I've lived so a long time, and the longer I live, the more convincing proofs I see of this truth. God governs in the affairs of men, and if a sparrow cannot fall to the ground without his notice, is it possible an empire could rise without his aid? We've been assured, sir, in the sacred writing," he called it sacred, by the way, "in the sacred writing, that unless the Lord builds the house, they labor in vain that build it." He's encouraged those at the convention that he also believed, in his words, that without his, he was talking about the same God, the same Lord he had just referenced. He said, without his concurring aid, we shall succeed in our political building no better than the builders of Babel. We'll be confounded by our local partial interests, and we ourselves shall become a byword down through the ages. And now, here we are, all these years later. That was 1787 that Franklin said those words, late June. Here, all these years later, since 1787, we have a motion to create chaplains in the military to help people not believe in what Ben Franklin said was the God who governs in the affairs of men, generically speaking. But it is important that people have the freedom to choose what they believe. As the founders believed that God gave us freedom of choice, that He gave us, our Creator gave us those rights, they also believed that people should have the chance to choose right or wrong as well. As an exchange student of the Soviet Union back in the 70s, I saw people and became very good friends with some college students who didn't have our rights, who envied our rights, who would love to have shared the rights that we have. And ultimately, we saw that play out a couple of decades later when many across the former Soviet Union demanded those rights. Of the 15 states that made up the Socialist Republic, some have gone back to those ways. Some, I was intrigued, some are scared when they're giving that much freedom to choose where they work. You mean I've got to find a job, but I've never had to look for a job? And it's a little scary because, as so many Americans, particularly over the last 5 years, have found, it can be very, very difficult to find a job. And so the idea that the government may just tell you what your job is, tell you whether you get a chance to go to college or not, that sounds good. I don't have to think about those decisions. Let the government do it for us. And it's shocking, but there are many, and there have grown to be many in America, who like the idea of the government telling them what they can do, when they can do it, how they can do it. Takes away the need to really wrestle with those things. Or, as so many of the signers of the Declaration believed, to have to pray about it and struggle with the decision and try to find out, as many of them did, what is God's will for our lives. Peter Muhlenberg from Pennsylvania, we have the statue of him. It was just down the hall, but when the visitor center opened, he was moved. But he is the Christian minister, pastor, who is depicted in the statue, taking off his ministerial robe as he preached from Ecclesiastes. There's a time for every purpose under heaven. And as he told his congregation, there is a time for peace and there is a time for war, and now is the time for war. And he led men from his congregation to join the military and to fight for freedom. His brother Frederick, who also has a statue here, Frederick was the first Speaker of the House under our new Constitution. He had not actually immediately been in favor of the Revolution, but after his church was burned down by the British, he kind of thought maybe it was a decent idea for ministers to be involved in a revolution and for ministers to be involved in government where there was self-government of a people. So that brings us to today. From the Revolutionary years to the Constitution after the Articles of Confederation fell apart. And once, now there was debate on Ben Franklin's proposal, because under the Continental Congress they had prayer every day to start their sessions. But the only way they could do that with the diverse Christian denominations, including the Quakers, was to agree on a minister that they believed would not offend the others and pay him to be the chapel. But as they pointed out during the debate over Franklin's proposal, we don't have money. We're not getting paid. We're here for a constitutional convention, but we don't have money like we did in the Continental Congress. We can't hire a chaplain. But once the Constitution was passed and ratified, from the time of the first Congress, that first day, actually when George Washington was sworn in at the Federal Building in New York, made his way down to the chapel that's still there, the only building that was unaffected at ground zero as the towers fell. They had a prayer session for the nation. And then each Congress, ever since, House and Senate, began each day with prayer before they ever began their session. Still true today. But, again, today we have the feeling that those who believe there's no God are insecure enough that they need somebody to encourage them in their unbelief. One of the dangers, though, we have come to face and come to realize is that many in our nation are choosing political correctness over safety. Yes, we all in this body, all of our armed forces, when I was in the Army 4 years, we took that oath. We were supposed to support, protect the Constitution. Everybody I knew was prepared to die for it, to die for their country if necessary. Those people are still serving. Of course, we found out, though, that if you get too involved in political correctness, and it's politically correct to look the other way when people are talking about hatred for America and wanting America to have the Constitution subordinated to Sharia law, that, gee, it's just politically correct not to face the facts that those people exist and that some of them are in the military. So they pass a man up the system so that he is there to counsel Christians, atheists, others who need counseling. And with the people I've talked to in the military, especially in Afghanistan, when we were in Iraq, when you have a commander-in-chief who on his watch does not allow you to fire at people who may be firing at you unless you can be sure you won't hit a civilian, at least that fear is put into those individuals. And I have asked for an official response from the Department of Defense, put in writing exactly what our rules of engagement are that our soldiers are fighting under. And we were told that's classified and it can't be provided in answer to your question. Well, somebody has passed it on to the military in harm's way, just like in August of 2011 when we had SEAL team members whose target was put on their backs by this administration when, first of all, the Vice President of the country violates the classified information laws and sets out in his speech who the commander was who brought down Osama bin Laden and about his Great SEAL team. And yes, he was paying them compliments, but he put a target on their back. And I know our Vice President did not intend to do that. He was just so excited, just as he was when he revealed where the undisclosed location was. He didn't mean to breach national security. He just was happy and whatever he was to reveal those kind of things. But he put people's lives in danger. One Marine soldier's or SEAL team member's father told me that right after the Vice President's speech, his daughter-in-law looked out the window. She had a Marine Guard out front. Karen and Billy Vaughn, they talk about how Aaron called them, part of SEAL Team 6, after they were outed. And it's been printed in the media that Leon Panetta, as a cabinet member, was meeting with people who could receive the classified information. But this administration wanted all the kudos they could get before the election, of course, and so they had producers of what I thought was a pretty good movie, Zero Dark 30, but he gave them classified information and told them who took out Osama bin Laden. But in August of 2011, our SEAL team members paid the ultimate price of this administration's carelessness. They paid with their lives. And it'd be nice to have out where we could talk about it as a nation just exactly what the rules of engagement are that our military are dying under, because there was a C-130 gunship there, and this was not from some classified source. I got it because it was information that was given to the family members, although the military may not have known what they gave. And there's testimony from the C-130 gunship pilot and others that they saw this group moving like a military group. They were not allowed to take them out. They even saw them shoot down our Chinook and kill our Americans, but there was a chance they might have hit civilians if they had killed the people that took down our SEAL Team 6 members, so they couldn't even kill them after they killed our people. We need to know what the rules of engagement are. We need to address the political correctness that is blinding our agencies and blinding our military of its ability to see who the enemy is, because it's getting people killed in harm's way. When you refuse to acknowledge that the Afghans you're training may be willing to turn their guns you're training them on and kill you, just as an Aggie friend had happened here recently in Afghanistan, what they call a green-on-blue killing, until we recognize that and recognize who our enemy is, and that our enemy can be among us, and that our enemy can be in uniforms that we're supposed to be friendly with, then more Americans are going to be killed needlessly. And when the political correctness of the FBI and the Justice Department and the State Department, Intelligence Department for that matter, is that you've got to leave mosques alone where people are being radicalized. And even though there were sting operations that identified people who were radicalizing Americans before this administration changed the policy, and they had to get friendly and reach out and partner, as the FBI said it originally did with CAIR, the Council of American Islamic Relations. And even though they've said they're not partnering with them, anytime CAIR says this offends us, then the FBI says, oh, gee, we better change it. When you've had the Fifth Circuit of the United States Court of Appeals confirmed that, yes, the evidence shows that CAIR, the Islamic Society of North America, those are front organizations for the Muslim Brotherhood. They want Sharia law to be the law of the land, not our Constitution. And that is what we did not take an oath to allow to happen. We took an oath to the Constitution, and that means no law shall be above our Constitution. And so that brings me to also the conversation, the question and answers with the FBI director this week. I have a great deal of respect for him. He has been a patriot. He fought in Vietnam. He's a warrior. He cares about the country. But he's done great damage to the FBI. He instituted an administrative policy that has caused thousands and thousands of years of experience to leave the FBI and say, under the new policy, I have to leave. So you have very willing, able, young FBI people who get in charge, but they have not benefited from the years of experience that others that had to leave had. I think that contributes to some of the problems that we see with our rights being protected, that we see with poor investigations. They just have not been the beneficiary of enough years of experience, and they've been taught by a lexicon, by language that does not allow them to talk about or see our enemy. I've been making the point for months that the Boston Massacre had clear potential to be completely avoided. And then when we find out Russia gave our administration information to say the older Tsarnaev brother has been radicalized and he's going to kill people, you better look into it, then all we've heard since the Boston bombing from this administration is the Russians should have given us more information. Now, I've grew to know a little bit about the way they think, and I don't entirely appreciate some of it, but I appreciate this. If they give information that says this person is going to kill Americans, understand we really don't care that much about whether they kill Americans, but we would like for you to recognize that these are the kind of people that will take out your government, will take out our government, and we'd like you to look into it. It's a thing of mutual concern. And when they put our government on notice, and the reaction of our government is, well, we did some interviews, we looked into it, we didn't find anything. The Russian, are you kidding us? We hand you somebody who is going to kill Americans, and you can't find anything? What's wrong with you? There's a great article, and I used it in questioning our FBI director. It was entitled, Obama Snooping Excludes Mosques, and it missed the Boston bombers. It says, since October 2011, mosques have been off limits to FBI agents. No more surveillance or undercover sting operations without high-level approval from a special oversight body at the Justice Department dubbed the Sensitive Operations Review Committee. Who makes up this body and how do they decide requests? Nobody knows. The names of the chairman, members, and staff are kept secret. The FBI director did not want to provide those as well. Mr. Speaker, did I ask how much time I have?
The gentleman has 6 minutes left.
So the FBI director, as I pointed out to him here before I asked the question further, pointed out that according to this article, the Bureau did not even contact mosque leaders for help in identifying the Boston bombers' images after those images were captured on closed-circuit TV cameras and cell phones. The FBI